The darkness was absolute. Not the kind of darkness you experience when you turn off the lights in a familiar room, but a living, breathing blackness that seemed to press against your eyeballs with the weight of the entire earth above. Specialist Danny Martinez crouched at the mouth of a tunnel entrance 30 kilometers northwest of Saigon, his flashlight beam cutting a thin red line into the void below. The air rising from the hole carried the scent of death, old sweat, human waste, and something else that made his stomach turn. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. Life expectancy of a tunnel rat is 7 seconds, the grizzled sergeant had told him during his first week in country. That's how long it takes Charlie to put a bullet in your brain or stick a knife in your gut. 7 seconds. The phrase echoed in Danny's mind as he checked his .38 special revolver one more time, running his thumb over each cartridge in the cylinder. Above ground, his squad mates waited in the suffocating heat of the Vietnamese jungle, M16s ready, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. But down there, in the labyrinth of tunnels that honeycombed the earth beneath their feet, Danny would be alone with whatever horrors the Viet Cong had prepared for him. He was 19 years old, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed 125 pounds soaking wet. The perfect size for crawling through spaces meant to break a man's spirit. In another life, he might have been fixing cars in East LA or working construction alongside his father. Instead, he was about to descend into what his fellow tunnel rats called the Black Echo, a world where death waited around every corner, where courage was measured in heartbeats, and where the only thing standing between him and the abyss was the red glow of his flashlight and whatever prayers he could remember from childhood. Danny took a deep breath, tasting the metallic fear on his tongue, and slipped into the earth. This is the story of the tunnel rats, the forgotten heroes who took America's war underground, armed with nothing but flashlights, pistols, and a courage that bordered on madness. Between 1965 and 1975, these volunteers descended into hell itself, pursuing an enemy that had turned the very earth into a weapon. Their tale is one of extraordinary bravery in the face of unimaginable terror, of young men who crawled through darkness so their brothers above could see another dawn. To understand the tunnel rats, one must first understand what they faced: an underground empire that defied everything American military doctrine had prepared them for. The tunnel systems of Vietnam weren't merely hiding places. They were subterranean cities that had been decades in the making, engineered with a sophistication that would have impressed the builders of ancient catacombs. The story began long before American boots touched Vietnamese soil. In the 1940s, during the fight against French colonial forces, Viet Minh guerrillas had carved the first crude tunnels into the red clay soil around Saigon. What started as simple bolt holes, narrow passages dug with hand tools and bamboo scoops, evolved through the 1950s and early 1960s into something far more ambitious. By the time American forces arrived in significant numbers, the Viet Cong had created an underground nation. The crown jewel of this subterranean empire was the Cu Chi Tunnel Complex, stretching over 250 kilometers from the outskirts of Saigon to the Cambodian border. But Cu Chi was just one piece of a vast puzzle. Similar networks riddled the Iron Triangle, Ben Cat, and dozens of other locations throughout South Vietnam. These weren't random burrows, but carefully planned infrastructure projects that took advantage of the unique geology of the region. The soil itself was an ally to the tunnel builders. The laterite clay that dominated much of the area around Saigon was soft and workable. When wet, but dried to a concrete-like hardness during the dry season. The Viet Cong learned to work with this natural phenomenon, digging during the rainy season when the earth was pliable, then allowing their tunnels to cure into structures that could withstand bombing and artillery fire. The complexity of these tunnel systems revealed itself slowly to American forces, each new discovery more astounding than the last. The tunnels were built on multiple levels, typically 3, though some areas had as many as 5 distinct layers. The first level, approximately 3 meters below ground, was designed to withstand small arms, fire, grenades, and light artillery. The second level, at 6 meters depth, could survive direct hits from mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. The deepest levels, some extending 12 meters or more underground, were virtually bomb-proof. Each level served specific functions in the underground ecosystem. The upper levels housed fighting positions, command posts, and quick-access storage areas for weapons and ammunition. The middle levels contained living quarters, kitchens, workshops, and first aid stations. The deepest levels were reserved for the most critical operations: field hospitals, where major surgery could be performed; munitions factories, where explosives were manufactured from salvaged American ordnance; and command centers, where strategy was planned and communications were coordinated. The engineering challenges were immense, and the Viet Cong met them with ingenuity born of desperation. Ventilation was perhaps the most critical concern. Hundreds of people living and working underground required fresh air, but conventional air shafts would be easily spotted by American patrols. The solution was a system of concealed vents disguised as termite mounds, anthills, or hidden beneath the thick roots of banyan trees. Air was drawn down through these camouflaged intakes and distributed through a network of smaller passages before being vented to the surface through cooking fires or other natural-looking exhaust points. Water presented another challenge. Wells were dug by hand, some extending 40 meters down to reach the water table. Drainage systems channeled rainwater away from living areas, while trapdoors and U-bends could be flooded instantly to drown pursuing soldiers. Some tunnel complexes included underwater passages that required swimmers to navigate, creating natural barriers that few surface dwellers could overcome. What American soldiers discovered beneath their feet challenged every assumption about guerrilla warfare. These weren't temporary hideouts, but permanent communities where entire families lived for months or years without seeing sunlight. Children were born in underground hospitals and attended schools carved from clay. Couples were married in subterranean chambers by candlelight. The elderly died in darkness and were buried in deeper chambers where their bodies would never be found. The tunnels included every facility necessary for a functioning society. Kitchens used smokeless stoves designed to vent cooking fumes through long horizontal passages before releasing them at the surface, often hundreds of meters from the actual cooking site. Workshops produced everything from sandals and clothing to sophisticated booby traps and explosives. Meeting halls large enough for hundreds of people hosted political rallies and cultural performances. One tunnel complex even included a theater where propaganda films were shown on equipment powered by bicycle generators. Medical facilities rivaled those found in many surface hospitals. Operating theaters were equipped with proper lighting, powered by generators or battery systems. Surgical instruments were manufactured on-site or salvaged from American medical supplies. Some tunnel hospitals maintained their own blood banks, using volunteers from the underground community to ensure adequate supplies for the wounded. The logistics of supporting such communities were staggering. Food had to be grown, processed, and distributed without attracting attention from the surface. The Viet Cong developed sophisticated caching systems, hiding rice and other supplies in waterproof containers throughout the tunnel networks. Some storage areas could feed hundreds of people for months, ensuring that sieges or surface bombardments couldn't starve out the underground populations. Perhaps most remarkably, these tunnel cities maintained their own manufacturing capabilities. Workshops produced uniforms, equipment, and weapons from raw materials and salvaged components. Bomb-making facilities turned unexploded American ordnance into improvised explosive devices. Print shops produced propaganda leaflets and forged documents. Some complexes even included their own radio stations, broadcasting propaganda to surface populations and coordinating operations across wide areas. No military manual prepared soldiers for the reality of tunnel warfare. The U.S. Army had no doctrine for fighting an enemy that lived beneath the earth, no training program for soldiers who would crawl through narrow passages in pursuit of death. In the early days of American involvement in Vietnam, tunnel clearance fell to whoever happened to be smallest in an infantry squad, often a reluctant volunteer who drew the short straw or earned the unwelcome attention of his sergeant. The selection process was brutally simple. Size mattered most. Tunnel entrances were typically no more than 80 centimeters wide and 120 centimeters high, with many passages considerably smaller. The average American soldier, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing 180 pounds or more, simply couldn't fit through openings designed for the smaller Vietnamese physique. This natural limitation meant that tunnel rats were almost invariably the shortest, lightest men in their units. Soldiers, who might have been overlooked for other dangerous assignments, found themselves volunteering for the most perilous job in the war. Mike Stubbs was typical of the early tunnel rats. A 19-year-old kid from Illinois who stood 5 feet 6 inches and weighed barely 130 pounds. "I was with the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division," he recalled decades later. They didn't have a tunnel rat company. Nobody did in those days. It was all volunteers. You couldn't order a man to go down in those holes. There were guys who would have taken a court-martial before they'd go underground. The volunteers came from every background America had to offer. There was David Sumner, a quiet kid from the Midwest, who learned to navigate tunnels with an almost supernatural sense for danger. James Anderson, an Apache from Oklahoma, who claimed his ancestors' spirits guided his hands away from tripwires. Eddie Martinez from East L.A., whose small hands could probe for traps in spaces where larger men couldn't reach. These weren't necessarily the bravest men in their units. Often they were simply the ones who couldn't find a way to say no when their country called. What set successful tunnel rats apart wasn't just their physical dimensions, but their psychological makeup. The job required a unique combination of traits that had little to do with traditional military virtues. Courage was essential, but not the kind of bold fearlessness celebrated in war movies. Tunnel work demanded a quiet, methodical bravery, the ability to function while fighting down panic, to think clearly while surrounded by death, to move forward when every instinct screamed retreat. Mental toughness was perhaps even more critical than physical courage. The tunnels were designed to break a man's mind as surely as his body. The darkness was absolute, the silence oppressive, except for the sounds that marked approaching death. The soft click of a booby trap mechanism, the whisper of movement in an adjacent passage, the wet breathing of an enemy soldier waiting in ambush. Men who could handle surface combat often broke completely when faced with the claustrophobic terror of underground warfare. Harold Roper, one of the earliest tunnel rats, described the psychological impact. "I felt more fear than I've ever come close to feeling before or since. The darkness down there wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive, pressing in on you from all sides. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face without the flashlight, and using the light meant painting a target on your forehead for anyone waiting in the shadows. The successful tunnel rats developed coping mechanisms that would have seemed bizarre to surface soldiers. Some sang softly to themselves, childhood lullabies or hymns that provided psychological comfort in the depths. Others developed superstitious rituals, checking their equipment in the same order every time, touching specific objects for luck, or reciting personal mantras before entering a tunnel. These weren't signs of weakness, but survival strategies developed by men operating at the very edge of human endurance. In the early years of American involvement, tunnel rat training was largely improvised and passed down from veteran to newcomer in an informal apprenticeship system. There was no school for tunnel warfare, no manual that explained how to detect booby traps by feel or navigate by sound in absolute darkness. Knowledge was purchased with blood and passed on through whispered conversations in base camps and field hospitals. The Australian military eventually established a formal training program at the School of Military Engineering near Sydney, where selected soldiers spent 3 months learning mine detection, booby trap disarmament, tunnel searching, and demolitions. But even this formal training could only prepare men for the technical aspects of the job. The psychological preparation came only through experience. Sergeant Robert "Batman" Batten became legendary among tunnel rats for his ability to teach survival skills that kept men alive underground. Batten had an almost mystical understanding of tunnel warfare, developed through dozens of underground missions where lesser men would have died. His students learned to move with supernatural quiet, to breathe in controlled patterns that wouldn't fog their flashlight lenses, to distinguish between the dozens of different sounds that could mean life or death in the tunnels. "Batman taught us to hear with our eyes and see with our ears," recalled one veteran. "He could tell you what kind of trap was waiting around the next corner, just by the way the air moved, or whether a passage was occupied by listening to the quality of the silence. The man saved my life a dozen times over, and I never saw him break a sweat." The training covered practical skills that were useless anywhere else in the military. Students learned to identify different types of clay by texture, since harder-packed earth often indicated the presence of booby traps or hidden chambers. They practiced moving through spaces barely larger than their own bodies, developing techniques for negotiating tight passages without becoming stuck or making noise. They learned to maintain their equipment in conditions of high humidity and constant dirt exposure, since a jammed weapon or failed flashlight meant certain death underground. Perhaps most importantly, they learned to overcome their natural human responses to confined spaces and darkness. Claustrophobia was a tunnel rat's greatest enemy, and training included exercises designed to build tolerance for tight spaces and absolute darkness. Men spent hours in simulated tunnel environments, learning to function while fighting down panic responses that were hardwired into human psychology. Tunnel rats traveled light by necessity, but their equipment was carefully chosen for reliability, in conditions that would destroy conventional military gear. The standard kit included a flashlight, a sidearm, a combat knife, and communications wire, usually telephone wire or string that connected the tunnel rat to his surface team. Everything else was luxury that could get a man killed if it caused him to become stuck in a narrow passage. The choice of weapons evolved through trial and error, often fatal error. Early tunnel rats used the standard issue M 1911.45 caliber pistol, but combat experience quickly revealed its limitations. The .45's loud report could temporarily deafen the shooter in a confined space, and its bright muzzle flash destroyed night vision for critical seconds. The psychological impact was devastating. Firing a .45 in a tunnel was like setting off a flashbulb in a dark room while someone screamed in your ear. Many tunnel rats switched to .38 special revolvers, which were quieter and produced less muzzle flash. The revolver's reliability in dirty conditions was another advantage. A jammed semi-automatic could mean death when facing an enemy at arm's length. Some tunnel rats preferred even smaller calibers, reasoning that shot placement was more important than stopping power in the confined spaces where they operated. Flashlights were equally critical and equally problematic. White lights were easily spotted by enemy soldiers and could betray a tunnel rat's position from hundreds of meters away. Red-filtered lights became standard, as they were harder for enemies to detect and preserve the user's night vision better than white light. Some tunnel rats learned to use their lights intermittently, navigating by brief glimpses rather than continuous illumination, but this technique required extraordinary skill and nerves. The combat knife served multiple purposes that had nothing to do with fighting. In experienced hands, it became a probe for detecting tripwires and pressure plates, a tool for testing the stability of tunnel walls and ceilings, and a last resort weapon when firearms were impractical. Some tunnel rats carried bayonets instead of knives, finding the longer blade useful for probing ahead without exposing their hands to booby traps. Communications equipment was perhaps the most important item in a tunnel rat's kit, though it was also the most problematic. Telephone wire allowed surface teams to track a tunnel rat's progress and provide emergency extraction if needed. But the wire could snag on obstacles, break at critical moments, or be cut by enemy soldiers. Some tunnel rats preferred simple string, which was less likely to tangle, but also less reliable for long-distance communication. Personal modifications to equipment were common and often ingenious. Some tunnel rats wrapped their flashlights in tape to prevent accidental activation or to muffle the sound of the switch. Others modified their weapons with improvised silencers made from soda cans or other available materials. Many carried spare batteries and bulbs for their flashlights, having learned that equipment failure underground was often a death sentence. The moment of entering a tunnel marked a transition from the world of the living to something else entirely, a realm where normal rules of warfare no longer applied, where death waited in forms that surface soldiers couldn't imagine. Every tunnel rat had his own ritual for this moment of truth, personal ceremonies that helped maintain sanity in the face of unthinkable terror. Danny Martinez always checked his equipment in the same order: flashlight, pistol, spare batteries, knife, communications wire. Then he would touch the small St. Christopher medal his grandmother had given him before shipping out, say a quick prayer in Spanish, and take 3 deep breaths before committing to the darkness below. These rituals weren't superstition. They were psychological anchors that provided stability in a world where nothing else could be trusted. The physical act of entering a tunnel was itself a challenge that could defeat men before they encountered any enemy. Tunnel entrances were deliberately designed to be difficult and dangerous, often requiring contortions that left soldiers vulnerable to attack. Some entrances were vertical shafts that dropped 4 or 5 feet before angling off into horizontal passages. Others required crawling through openings barely large enough for a human body, where getting stuck meant death by suffocation or enemy action. The first few feet underground were always the most dangerous. This was where the Viet Cong placed their most sophisticated traps, reasoning that soldiers who survived the entrance would be more cautious, deeper in the system. Grenades rigged to tripwires could decapitate an unwary tunnel rat before he'd traveled 10 feet from the surface. Punji stake pits, concealed beneath thin layers of earth, could impale a man who moved too quickly or carelessly. Mike Stubbs learned these lessons on his first tunnel mission near DN. I was maybe 30 or 40 yards down this tunnel when my flashlight went out, he remembered. You're talking about dark. Darker than anything you can imagine. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The only light I could see was where I'd come in, just a tiny dot way back behind me. I had to back out on my belly, feeling every inch of the way, knowing that if I'd missed a trap going in, I'd probably trigger it going out. Once past the entrance zones, tunnel rats entered an alien world that operated by different physical and psychological laws. The tunnels themselves were marvels of engineering that revealed new horrors with every foot of progress. Passages zigzagged at sharp angles, designed to dissipate blast waves from explosions, but also creating perfect ambush points where enemy soldiers could wait unseen around every corner. The air underground was thick and oppressive, often laden with the smell of human waste, rotting food, and death. Ventilation was minimal in many passages, and the carbon dioxide from a tunnel rat's breathing could quickly reach dangerous levels in confined spaces. Some veterans reported becoming lightheaded or disoriented from oxygen deprivation, adding another layer of danger to an already lethal environment. Temperature and humidity created their own challenges. The tunnels were often hotter than the surface, with humidity approaching 100% in many areas. Sweat poured constantly, fogging flashlight lenses and making equipment slippery and unreliable. Metal weapons and gear corroded rapidly in the damp conditions, and electronic equipment that might work perfectly on the surface would fail within hours underground. The construction of the tunnels revealed the ingenuity and desperation of their builders. Walls were reinforced with bamboo matting and wooden supports in critical areas, while other sections were left as raw earth that could collapse without warning. Floors were often uneven, with hidden pits, false floors, and sudden drop-offs that could send an unwary tunnel rat tumbling into deeper chambers or onto waiting punji stakes. Side passages branched off from main tunnels without warning, creating a three-dimensional maze that could disorient even experienced navigation specialists. Some of these branches led to storage areas, fighting positions, or living quarters. Others were death traps, false tunnels that ended in booby traps, or chambers that could be flooded instantly to drown intruders. The darkness was absolute and alive, with sounds that spoke of hidden dangers. Water dripping from ceiling cracks created an irregular percussion that could mask the sounds of approaching enemies. Rats scurried through the passages, their claws scratching against clay walls in patterns that could be mistaken for human movement. Bats roosted in larger chambers, their sudden flights creating rushes of air and sound that could trigger combat reflexes at the worst possible moments. The tunnels weren't empty passages, but active battlegrounds, where tunnel rats faced enemies both human and otherwise. Viet Cong soldiers, who lived and fought underground, had adapted to conditions that would break surface troops within hours. They moved through the passages with supernatural quiet, knew every trap and hiding place, and could navigate in absolute darkness, using senses that most people never develop. Combat in the tunnels occurred at ranges measured in inches rather than yards. Enemies might face each other across distances so short that they could feel each other's breath. Yet the darkness made identification impossible until weapons were drawn and fired. The psychological impact was devastating, knowing that death could be waiting within arm's reach, but being unable to see or hear any warning of its approach. David Sumner encountered his first enemy soldier in a tunnel near Kuchi during his third underground mission. I was crawling through this passage, maybe 3 feet high and just wide enough for my shoulders, when I heard breathing that wasn't mine, he recalled. Not heavy breathing, just the soft sound of someone trying to stay quiet. I stopped, and the breathing stopped too. We both knew the other was there, but neither of us could see anything in the dark. The standoff lasted several minutes, both men afraid to move or make noise that might give away their exact position. Finally, Sumner heard the soft scrape of metal on clay, his enemy drawing a knife or adjusting a weapon. "I emptied my pistol in the direction of the sound," he said. 6 rounds as fast as I could pull the trigger. When the echo died away and my ears stopped ringing, there was no more breathing except mine. But human enemies weren't the only threats tunnel rats faced underground. The Viet Cong had weaponized the tunnel ecosystem, turning natural inhabitants into living booby traps. Venomous snakes, cobras, kraits, and bamboo vipers were captured and tethered in strategic locations, positioned to strike at head or hand level when triggered by tripwires or movement. The psychological impact of these living traps was often worse than their physical danger, as the knowledge that death could literally drop from the ceiling added another layer of terror to an already nightmarish environment. Scorpions lurked in wall crevices and hidden ledges, their stings painful and potentially dangerous in the confined conditions where medical help was far away. Centipedes and other insects created constant irritation and distraction for men who needed every sense focused on survival. Even rats, the 4-legged variety, posed health risks through disease transmission and the psychological stress of sharing narrow spaces with vermin. The Viet Cong elevated booby trap construction to an art form that would have impressed medieval torture masters. Every tunnel system was seeded with devices designed not just to kill, but to maim, terrorize, and slow down pursuing forces. The psychological warfare aspect was as important as the physical damage. Survivors of booby trap attacks spread fear throughout their units, making other soldiers reluctant to enter tunnels even when military necessity demanded it. Grenade traps were among the most common and effective devices tunnel rats encountered. These ranged from simple tripwire mechanisms that pulled pins when disturbed to sophisticated pressure plates that detonated only when sufficient weight was applied. Some were designed with time delays, allowing intruders to pass safely before exploding behind them, cutting off retreat routes and potentially burying survivors under tons of collapsed earth. Punji stake traps represented the most psychologically devastating weapons in the Viet Cong arsenal. These pits, lined with sharpened bamboo spikes, were positioned to impale legs, torso, or head, depending on their placement. The stakes were often smeared with human waste to ensure infection and gangrene, even if the initial wounds weren't fatal. The knowledge that a single misstep could result in impalement on feces-covered spikes added a layer of revulsion to the fear that tunnel rats already carried. More sophisticated traps revealed the engineering skills of their creators. False floors concealed deeper pits, or chambers filled with water, spikes, or other hazards. Weighted doors would swing shut behind passing soldiers, trapping them in chambers that could be flooded or filled with poison gas. Some passages included mechanisms that could collapse sections of tunnel, burying intruders alive while preserving the rest of the system for continued use. The Viet Cong also employed what could only be described as psychological warfare traps, devices designed more to terrorize than to kill. Chambers filled with decomposing bodies, arranged in grotesque positions, were intended to break the morale of discovery teams. Hidden speakers, powered by batteries or hand cranks, would suddenly emit screams or laughter in the darkness. Some tunnels included false chambers designed to look like torture areas, complete with restraints and bloodstains, though these were often theatrical props rather than actual sites of torture. Gas traps represented perhaps the most sophisticated booby trap systems tunnel rats encountered. These ranged from simple smoke grenades designed to disorient and blind to actual poison gas that could kill within minutes. Some gas traps were triggered by movement or light, while others operated on timers that could be set to activate hours after intruders had passed through an area. Tunnel rat missions followed patterns dictated by the discovery of new entrances, intelligence reports, and the endless cycle of operations designed to deny the Viet Cong their underground sanctuaries. A typical mission began when infantry patrols or helicopter crews spotted suspicious activity, freshly turned earth, unusual vegetation patterns, or the telltale signs of ventilation systems disguised as natural features. The 25th Infantry Division developed one of the most systematic approaches to tunnel warfare, with dedicated teams that moved from site to site across their area of operations. Lieutenant Thomas Seitzinger led one such team through the Iron Triangle, where his tunnel rats explored what intelligence officials believed to be the main Viet Cong infiltration route through the region. We'd searched about 5 miles of tunneling that generally ran north to south, Seitzinger reported. The exact length wasn't known, but the Vietnamese provincial reconnaissance units told us it took 3 days and nights to travel the full length. Every time we'd reach a point where the tunnel had collapsed from Air Force bombing, the PRUS would look around and say, "Dig here," and sure enough, we'd find it again. A tunnel clearing operation required careful coordination between surface and underground elements. While 1 or 2 tunnel rats worked below, surface teams provided security, maintained communications, and prepared for emergency extraction or medical evacuation. The surface team's job was often more nerve-wracking than that of the tunnel rats themselves, waiting helplessly while friends disappeared into the earth, listening to muffled sounds of movement or combat from below, never knowing if the next tug on the communications wire would signal success or tragedy. The technical aspects of tunnel clearance evolved as experience revealed what worked and what got people killed. Early operations often involved sending soldiers into tunnels with no preparation or support, resulting in casualties that served mainly to educate survivors about the dangers they faced. By 1968, tunnel rat teams had developed sophisticated procedures that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing unnecessary risks. Pre-entry reconnaissance became standard procedure whenever time and circumstances permitted. This might involve dropping smoke grenades or tear gas into suspected entrances to determine the extent of tunnel systems and identify additional openings. Listening devices could sometimes detect movement or voices underground, providing intelligence about enemy presence and numbers. In some cases, trained dogs were used to detect human scents emanating from tunnel openings, though this technique had limited success due to the contaminating odors of decay and human waste that pervaded most tunnel systems. Combat in the tunnels followed rhythms unlike any other form of warfare. Engagements were typically brief but intensely violent, fought at ranges where missing was almost impossible, but where superior firepower offered no advantage. The side that detected the enemy first usually won, but detection often came only at the moment when killing or being killed were the only options. Earl Gulp learned this lesson during his first encounter with an enemy soldier in a tunnel near Ben Cat. "I was maybe 20 feet into this passage when I heard something move ahead of me," he remembered. "Not loud, just the soft sound of cloth against clay. I stopped, and everything went quiet. I knew someone was there, maybe 10 feet away, but I couldn't see anything, even with the flashlight." The psychological pressure of these standoffs was enormous. Both combatants knew the other's location within a few feet, but the darkness made precise targeting impossible. Movement meant giving away position, but remaining stationary allowed the enemy time to maneuver or prepare an attack. The decision to shoot often came down to nerve rather than tactical considerations. Who would crack first under the pressure of knowing death was within arm's reach? "I finally decided to move forward," Gulp continued. I figured if I was going to die, I'd rather die trying to complete the mission than backing out of the tunnel. I crawled another 5 feet and swept my light beam across the passage ahead. That's when I saw him. A Viet Cong soldier crouched in a side chamber, rifle pointed right at me. We both fired at the same instant. The aftermath of tunnel combat was as challenging as the fighting itself. Bodies had to be removed from narrow passages without triggering additional booby traps. Wounded soldiers required extraction through spaces barely large enough for healthy men, often while under fire from other enemy positions. The confined spaces made medical treatment almost impossible underground, meaning that seriously wounded tunnel rats had to be evacuated to the surface before they could receive life-saving care. Equipment recovery presented its own challenges. Weapons and gear dropped during combat often fell into areas that couldn't be safely accessed, and the Viet Cong were quick to salvage anything left behind. Some tunnel rat teams developed techniques for recovering equipment using improvised hooks and lines, but often items lost in combat had to be written off as unrecoverable. Despite the dangers, tunnel operations provided some of the most valuable intelligence of the entire Vietnam War. The underground complexes served as command centers, communications hubs, and storage facilities for Viet Cong operations throughout South Vietnam. Documents, equipment, and prisoners captured in tunnel raids often provided insights into enemy capabilities and intentions that couldn't be obtained through any other means. One of the most significant intelligence discoveries occurred in 1970 when tunnel rats uncovered a major signals intelligence facility where Viet Cong codebreakers had been intercepting and decoding American military communications. The facility contained sophisticated radio equipment, code books, and translated copies of transmissions from the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions. The loss of this capability immediately made American operations more effective and reduced the number of successful enemy ambushes. Document recovery required special techniques developed specifically for tunnel operations. Papers found underground were often damaged by humidity or contaminated with human waste, making preservation challenging. Tunnel rats learned to handle documents carefully, using plastic bags or other waterproof containers to protect evidence during extraction. Photography of documents in place became standard procedure when portable cameras became available, ensuring that information wouldn't be lost if original papers were damaged during removal. The variety of intelligence materials found in tunnels revealed the scope of Viet Cong operations and their sophisticated organizational structure. Maps showing American base locations and patrol routes demonstrated the effectiveness of enemy reconnaissance efforts. Lists of sympathizers and agents provided counterintelligence opportunities that helped identify security leaks. Battle plans and operational orders gave American commanders insights into enemy intentions and capabilities that influenced strategic decision-making at the highest levels. Weapons caches discovered in tunnels provided both tactical advantages and intelligence about enemy supply systems. Captured weapons could be analyzed to determine their origin and route of supply, helping intelligence analysts understand how the Viet Cong obtained military equipment despite American interdiction efforts. Some weapons caches included items that had been reported as lost or stolen from American facilities, revealing the extent of enemy infiltration and the effectiveness of their supply networks. The physical and psychological demands of tunnel warfare took a devastating toll on the men who fought underground. Most tunnel rats served multiple tours in the tunnels, accumulating damage that wouldn't become fully apparent until years after the war ended. The combination of physical stress, psychological trauma, and environmental hazards created health problems that would plague veterans for the rest of their lives. Physical injuries were common and often severe. The confined spaces made it impossible to avoid contact with contaminated surfaces, leading to infections and diseases that were rarely seen in surface combat. Cuts and scrapes from sharp edges or rough surfaces became infected in the humid, bacteria-rich environment underground. Exposure to human waste and decomposing organic matter created health hazards that proper field sanitation couldn't address. Respiratory problems developed from inhaling dust, spores, and chemical residues in poorly ventilated spaces. Some tunnel rats reported persistent coughing and breathing difficulties that lasted for months after completing their tours underground. The long-term effects of exposure to Agent Orange and other defoliants were compounded by the concentrated residues found in soil that had been saturated with these chemicals over multiple growing seasons. Back and joint problems resulted from hours spent crawling through narrow passages and contorting bodies into unnatural positions. Many tunnel rats developed chronic pain conditions that limited their mobility and quality of life for decades after the war. The repetitive stress of tunnel movement, combined with the tension of constant alertness for danger, created muscular and skeletal problems that conventional military medicine wasn't equipped to address. Psychological trauma from tunnel operations often exceeded that experienced by other combat veterans. The combination of claustrophobia, sensory deprivation, and constant mortal danger created stress levels that pushed men beyond normal human endurance limits. Many tunnel rats reported persistent nightmares featuring underground scenarios, claustrophobic panic attacks triggered by enclosed spaces, and hypervigilance that made normal social interactions difficult or impossible. Sleep disorders became endemic among tunnel rat veterans, many of whom found it impossible to sleep in complete darkness for years after their service ended. Bob, a tunnel rat veteran who later worked as a janitor, described his ongoing struggles. "I always carry a flashlight with me now. I always sleep with a light on. Being in the dark or waking up in the dark is terrifying for me. A dark room can instantly trigger a flashback, and I feel like I'm back in a tunnel. Sometimes it takes 2 days before I feel like I'm fully back in the present." The largest and most ambitious tunnel operation of the Vietnam War began on January 8, 1967, when elements of the 1st Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and Australian forces launched Operation Crimp against the Siu Chai Tunnel Complex. The operation represented the first systematic attempt to destroy the Viet Cong's underground empire using coordinated surface and subsurface tactics. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Siu Chai tunnels housed several thousand Viet Cong fighters and served as a major command and logistical center for operations throughout the Saigon area. The tunnels were known to contain weapons factories, hospitals, training facilities, and storage areas that supported guerrilla activities across multiple provinces. American commanders hoped that a massive coordinated assault could eliminate this threat and deny the Viet Cong one of their most important assets. The surface assault proceeded according to plan, with infantry in armored units establishing blocking positions, while helicopter-borne forces landed directly on top of suspected tunnel areas. However, the underground component of the operation quickly revealed the limitations of conventional military doctrine when applied to tunnel warfare. The tunnel systems were far more extensive and sophisticated than intelligence reports had suggested, and the Viet Cong had prepared defensive measures specifically designed to counter American tactics. Tunnel rats entering the Siu Chai complex found themselves facing a three-dimensional battlefield unlike anything they had previously encountered. The tunnels extended over multiple levels, with passages connecting distant areas through routes that surface forces couldn't monitor or control. Enemy soldiers could appear behind American positions by traveling through underground passages, attack briefly, and then disappear into the earth before effective countermeasures could be organized. Captain Herbert Thornton led the specialized tunnel teams during Operation Crimp, and his after-action reports provided some of the first detailed intelligence about the scope and sophistication of Viet Cong underground operations. We discovered that what we thought was a tunnel system was actually an underground city, Thornton reported. These weren't hiding places. They were permanent installations designed to support large-scale military operations indefinitely. The tunnel clearing operations during Crimp revealed both the potential and the limitations of American tunnel rat capabilities. Small teams of volunteers proved capable of penetrating even the most sophisticated tunnel defenses, but the sheer scale of the underground complexes made complete clearance impossible with available resources. Individual tunnel rats could explore and map sections of the system, but securing and holding underground territory required manpower that simply wasn't available. Following the lessons learned during Operation Crimp, American forces developed more sophisticated approaches to tunnel warfare during subsequent operations in the Iron Triangle. This heavily defended area northwest of Saigon contained some of the most elaborate tunnel systems in South Vietnam, and clearing operations there became a proving ground for evolved tunnel rat tactics and equipment. The Iron Triangle campaigns introduced the concept of coordinated surface and subsurface operations, designed to exploit the strengths of both conventional and tunnel rat forces. Surface units would establish security perimeters and provide fire support, while tunnel rats worked below. But the underground teams would also direct surface fires against targets they identified from their unique vantage point beneath enemy positions. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig, later to become Secretary of State, commanded one of the units involved in Iron Triangle operations and provided detailed reports on the effectiveness of integrated tunnel warfare tactics. The tunnel rats provided intelligence and targeting information that we simply couldn't obtain through any other means, Haig noted. Their ability to locate enemy positions from below and direct accurate fires against those positions proved to be one of our most effective tactical innovations. The scale of tunnel systems discovered in the Iron Triangle exceeded even the most pessimistic intelligence estimates. Tunnel rats explored networks that extended for miles in multiple directions, connecting distant geographic areas through underground passages that bypassed all surface security measures. Some tunnels were large enough to accommodate vehicles, and several underground complexes included repair facilities for maintaining captured American equipment. One of the most significant discoveries during Iron Triangle operations was an underground tank park, where the Viet Cong had hidden several American armored vehicles that had been reported as destroyed in previous engagements. The vehicles had been repaired using parts salvaged from other equipment and were being prepared for use in future operations against American forces. This discovery led to changes in how destroyed equipment was handled and demonstrated the importance of denying salvageable materials to enemy forces. Operation Cedar Falls, launched in January 1967, represented the largest tunnel warfare operation of the Vietnam War. The operation involved over 30,000 American and South Vietnamese troops in a coordinated effort to eliminate Viet Cong strongholds in the Iron Triangle and adjacent areas. Tunnel rats played a crucial role in the operation, providing the specialized capabilities needed to exploit intelligence discoveries and deny underground facilities to enemy forces. The planning for Cedar Falls incorporated lessons learned from previous tunnel operations, including the need for specialized equipment, trained personnel, and coordinated surface-subsurface tactics. Tunnel rat teams were integrated into the operation from the planning stages, rather than being added as an afterthought when tunnel systems were discovered. This approach allowed for more effective use of tunnel rat capabilities and better coordination with conventional forces. The scale of the tunnel systems encountered during Cedar Falls shocked even experienced tunnel rat veterans. Gary Oatman, an engineer assigned to tunnel clearing duties during the operation, recalled, "We thought we knew what we were getting into based on previous operations, but nothing had prepared us for what we found in the Iron Triangle. The tunnels went on for miles. We'd clear one section only to discover that it connected to 3 or 4 other complexes that we hadn't even known existed." Intelligence discoveries during Cedar Falls provided unprecedented insights into Viet Cong organization and capabilities. Documents recovered from underground command centers revealed the structure of enemy units, their supply systems, and their operational plans for future activities. Communications equipment found in the tunnels allowed American intelligence specialists to monitor enemy radio traffic and potentially influence their decision-making through disinformation campaigns. The weapons and equipment discoveries during Cedar Falls demonstrated the sophistication of Viet Cong underground manufacturing capabilities. Tunnel rats discovered workshops capable of producing everything from small arms ammunition to complex explosives using materials salvaged from American sources. Some facilities included equipment for repairing electronic devices, suggesting that the Viet Cong had technical capabilities that intelligence analysts had previously underestimated. Medical facilities found during Cedar Falls operations rivaled those available to American forces in terms of equipment and capabilities. Underground hospitals included operating theaters, recovery wards, and pharmaceutical storage areas, stocked with medicines obtained through various supply channels. Some facilities had been treating wounded Viet Cong fighters for months without detection by American intelligence services. The major tunnel operations of 1967 and 1968 achieved significant tactical successes, but at enormous cost in human terms. Tunnel rat casualties during these operations exceeded 50% in some units, with many survivors requiring medical evacuation for injuries that ended their combat careers. The psychological toll was even higher, as the intensity and duration of underground combat pushed many men beyond their psychological breaking points. Mike Stubbs participated in several major tunnel operations and witnessed the cumulative effect of underground combat on his fellow tunnel rats. Guys would volunteer for the first mission, maybe the second and third, but after that, you could see the change in them, he remembered. The constant fear, the claustrophobia, the knowledge that every step could be your last. It wore men down in ways that surface combat never did. We lost more guys to psychological breakdown than to enemy action. The medical evacuation statistics from major tunnel operations revealed the unique hazards of underground warfare. In addition to conventional combat injuries, tunnel rats suffered from a range of conditions rarely seen in other military specialties. Severe claustrophobic reactions that required sedation and evacuation, respiratory problems from exposure to underground contaminants, and infection rates that exceeded those of surface forces by significant margins. Equipment losses during major operations also demonstrated the challenging nature of tunnel warfare. Weapons jammed by mud and humidity often couldn't be cleared in the confined spaces where they were needed most. Communications equipment failed at critical moments, leaving tunnel rats isolated from surface support when they most needed assistance. Flashlights and other essential gear were lost or destroyed at rates that logistics planners hadn't anticipated, leading to equipment shortages that affected operational effectiveness. Despite these costs, the major tunnel operations achieved strategic objectives that couldn't have been accomplished through conventional means. The intelligence gathered from underground facilities provided insights into enemy capabilities and intentions that influenced American strategy throughout the war. The denial of underground sanctuaries forced the Viet Cong to alter their operational patterns, making them more vulnerable to conventional military action. The Viet Cong understood that tunnel warfare was as much a battle for psychological dominance as physical territory. Every aspect of their tunnel systems was designed not just to provide military advantage, but to break the morale and mental stability of enemy soldiers who dared to enter their underground domain. The psychological warfare conducted in the tunnels represented some of the most sophisticated and effective terror tactics employed during the Vietnam War. The design of tunnel entrances themselves served psychological as well as tactical purposes. Many entrances were constructed as obvious traps, vertical shafts that dropped several feet before angling into horizontal passages, clearly designed to injure or kill anyone who entered carelessly. The message was unmistakable. This is our territory, and you enter at your own risk. Even when these obvious traps were detected and disarmed, they served their purpose by increasing the anxiety and caution of attacking forces. The placement of booby traps followed psychological principles as well as tactical ones. The most sophisticated traps were often placed not at tunnel entrances, where soldiers expected them, but deeper in the systems where men might begin to relax their guard. The randomness of trap placement created constant stress, as tunnel rats could never be certain when they might trigger a device that would kill or maim them. Sound was weaponized in ways that exploited basic human fears and psychological vulnerabilities. Hidden speakers, powered by batteries or hand cranks, would suddenly emit screams, laughter, or recorded voices in languages the tunnel rats couldn't understand. These psychological operations were designed to create confusion and fear, making soldiers doubt their own senses and judgment in situations where clear thinking was essential for survival. The Viet Cong exploited every aspect of the underground environment to create psychological pressure on tunnel rats. The absolute darkness of the tunnels was used as a weapon, with enemy soldiers who had adapted to underground conditions maintaining advantages over surface troops who depended on artificial light. The knowledge that enemies could see and move effectively in conditions that rendered tunnel rats nearly helpless added constant stress to an already terrifying environment. Smell became both an intelligence tool and a psychological weapon in tunnel warfare. The Viet Cong learned to identify American soldiers by their distinctive odors: soap, toothpaste, cigarettes, and other personal hygiene products that were foreign to the underground environment. Conversely, they used strong odors to disorient and nauseate tunnel rats. Human waste, rotting food, and decomposing bodies were strategically placed to create olfactory barriers that few men could overcome without protective equipment. The texture and temperature of surfaces in the tunnels provided constant reminders of the alien nature of the underground environment. Walls slick with humidity, floors covered in mud and organic waste, and ceilings that dripped constantly created sensory experiences that reinforced feelings of being trapped in an unnatural and hostile environment. The Viet Cong enhanced these natural conditions by adding materials that would stick to clothing and skin, creating psychological associations that persisted long after soldiers returned to the surface. Touch became a primary sense for navigation and threat detection in the tunnels, but the Viet Cong weaponized this dependency by creating false textures and misleading surface characteristics. Tripwires were often made from materials that felt like natural roots or vines, while pressure plates were disguised to feel like stable flooring. This manipulation of tactile information forced tunnel rats to question every sensation, creating mental exhaustion that degraded their decision-making capabilities. Perhaps the most effective psychological warfare tactic employed by the Viet Cong was the deliberate cultivation of specific phobias that would persist long after soldiers left the tunnels. Claustrophobia was the most obvious target, but enemy psychological operations went far beyond simply exploiting natural fears of confined spaces. The use of living creatures as psychological weapons demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Venomous snakes tethered near tunnel entrances created immediate physical danger. But the knowledge that serpents might be waiting at any point in a tunnel system created constant anxiety that affected decision-making and movement. Even when no snakes were present, tunnel rats remained hypersensitive to any sound or sensation that might indicate their presence. Arachnophobia and entomophobia were exploited through the deliberate cultivation of spider and insect populations in tunnel systems. Some passages were deliberately designed to channel spiders and other arthropods toward areas where tunnel rats would encounter them. The psychological impact of suddenly finding oneself covered with spiders in a confined space where escape was impossible created panic reactions that could be lethal in combat situations. Water phobias were exploited through the construction of passages that could be flooded without warning, creating situations where tunnel rats might find themselves trapped in rising water with no escape route. Even when these traps weren't activated, the knowledge that they existed created constant anxiety about every pool of water or damp area encountered underground. The cumulative psychological pressure of tunnel warfare created mental health casualties that military medicine was poorly equipped to address. Traditional combat stress reactions were well understood, but the unique psychological challenges of underground warfare produced symptoms and conditions that didn't fit established treatment protocols. Claustrophobic panic attacks became epidemic among tunnel rat veterans, often triggered by situations that had no obvious connection to tunnel warfare. Elevators, small rooms, crowds, and even certain lighting conditions could produce severe anxiety reactions years after soldiers had completed their service. The medical community struggled to understand why combat veterans who had handled surface warfare effectively were being disabled by fears of confined spaces. Sensory processing disorders developed in many tunnel rat veterans, manifesting as hypersensitivity to sounds, textures, or visual stimuli that reminded them of underground experiences. Some veterans reported being unable to tolerate darkness for years after their service, requiring lights to remain on continuously even during sleep. Others developed tactile hypersensitivity that made normal physical contact painful or distressing. Sleep disorders plagued tunnel rat veterans at rates far exceeding those of other combat specialties. The hypervigilance required for underground survival created psychological habits that persisted long after the danger had passed. Many veterans reported being unable to sleep without first checking all possible entrances to their sleeping areas, or being awakened by sounds that others couldn't detect. Treatment options for these conditions were limited by the military medical community's lack of understanding of the unique psychological challenges of tunnel warfare. Standard combat stress protocols focused on helping soldiers return to duty, but many tunnel rat veterans required extensive psychological rehabilitation that wasn't available through military channels. Some conditions proved to be permanent disabilities that affected veterans' quality of life for decades after the war ended. The extreme psychological pressures of tunnel warfare created unique bonds among tunnel rat veterans that transcended normal military camaraderie. The shared experience of facing death in conditions that most people couldn't imagine created relationships characterized by mutual understanding and support that lasted long after the war ended. Tunnel rat veterans developed their own informal support networks that provided psychological assistance when official channels failed to address their specific needs. These networks operated through personal relationships, veteran organizations, and informal gatherings where men could discuss experiences that civilian society couldn't understand or accept. The psychological isolation experienced by many tunnel rat veterans was compounded by society's general unwillingness to hear about the realities of underground warfare. The graphic nature of tunnel combat, combined with public opposition to the Vietnam War, created social conditions where veterans felt unable to discuss their experiences or seek help for psychological problems related to their service. Support group therapy became one of the few effective treatments for tunnel rat veterans, allowing them to discuss their experiences with others who had faced similar challenges. These groups provided validation for experiences that seemed too extreme to be believable, and offered practical coping strategies developed by men who had successfully managed their psychological trauma. When the last American troops withdrew from Vietnam in 1975, the tunnel rats came home carrying wounds that couldn't be seen or easily understood. Unlike the visible injuries of surface combat, missing limbs, shrapnel scars, or burns from napalm, the damage inflicted by underground warfare was largely psychological and neurological, invisible to medical examination but devastating in its long-term effects on the men who had crawled through hell to serve their country. The medical community of the 1970s was poorly equipped to diagnose or treat the complex array of conditions that afflicted tunnel rat veterans. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formally recognized until 1980, and even then, the diagnostic criteria didn't adequately address the unique psychological trauma of underground warfare. Veterans found themselves struggling with symptoms that didn't fit established medical categories, seeking help for conditions that doctors couldn't name or understand. Bob, the tunnel rat, who later worked as a janitor at Fort Leonard Wood, exemplified the challenges faced by thousands of veterans. The VA doctors kept asking me about firefights and artillery attacks, but that wasn't what haunted me, he explained. It was the darkness, the feeling of being buried alive, the knowledge that death was waiting in every shadow. How do you explain to someone who's never been underground that you can't sleep without a light on, that enclosed spaces make you panic, that the sound of dripping water can trigger flashbacks so vivid you forget where you are? The hypervigilance that had kept tunnel rats alive in Vietnam became a disability in civilian life. Veterans found themselves unable to relax, constantly scanning their environment for threats that no longer existed. Simple activities like entering a building, walking through a crowd, or even lying down to sleep became exercises in anxiety management. The survival instincts that had served them well in the tunnels now isolated them from normal social interactions and relationships. Tunnel rats faced unique exposure risks that weren't fully understood until decades after the war ended. Their work required extensive contact with contaminated soil, often for hours at a time in confined spaces where protective equipment was impractical or impossible to use. The chemicals that had been sprayed on the surface concentrated in the soil and were absorbed through skin contact, inhalation, and inadvertent ingestion during underground operations. The health effects of this exposure began manifesting years or decades after veterans returned home, often in forms that weren't immediately connected to their military service. Cancers, neurological disorders, skin conditions, and reproductive problems appeared at rates far exceeding those of the general population. But establishing causal relationships between tunnel service and these conditions required medical research that took decades to complete. David Sumner developed lung cancer in his 50s, despite never having been a smoker. The doctors kept asking about cigarettes, asbestos exposure, family history, anything except my service in Vietnam, he recalled. It wasn't until I connected with other tunnel rat veterans that I realized how many of us were developing the same kinds of health problems. We'd been poisoned by our own government's chemicals, and nobody wanted to acknowledge it. The Veterans Administration's recognition of Agent Orange-related conditions came slowly and incompletely, often excluding conditions that tunnel rat veterans experienced at disproportionate rates. The burden of proof was placed on veterans to demonstrate connections between their military service and their health problems, a requirement that was difficult to meet for men whose service records often contained minimal documentation of their underground exposure. Reproductive health effects became apparent as tunnel rat veterans started families, with birth defects and developmental problems in their children occurring at alarming rates. The psychological trauma of realizing that their service had potentially harmed their own children added another layer of guilt and anguish to the burden these men already carried. In the absence of adequate medical or psychological support from official sources, tunnel rat veterans began organizing their own support networks. The Vietnam Tunnel Rats Association was formed to provide mutual assistance and advocacy for veterans whose unique service wasn't recognized or understood by mainstream veteran organizations. These informal networks became crucial sources of information and support for men struggling with conditions that the medical establishment couldn't adequately address. Veterans shared coping strategies, treatment options, and resources for dealing with everything from claustrophobia to Agent Orange exposure. The validation provided by contact with others who had shared similar experiences often proved more therapeutic than formal medical treatment. George Canali, a tunnel rat from the 25th Infantry Division, found healing through participation in Operation Wild Horse, a program designed specifically for combat veterans struggling with PTSD. "For years, I thought I was going crazy," he explained. "The nightmares, the panic attacks, the inability to be in small spaces. I couldn't understand why I was falling apart when other guys seemed to be handling their service just fine. It wasn't until I met other tunnel rats that I realized my reactions were normal responses to abnormal situations." The therapeutic value of storytelling became apparent as tunnel rat veterans began sharing their experiences with researchers, journalists, and other veterans. Many found that talking about their underground experiences, often for the first time since returning from Vietnam, provided significant psychological relief. The act of bearing witness to their own survival and honoring their fallen comrades became an important part of the healing process. The unique contributions of tunnel rats began receiving recognition decades after the war ended, as historians and military analysts gained better understanding of their crucial role in Vietnam operations. Books, documentaries, and academic studies highlighted the extraordinary courage and effectiveness of these underground warriors, providing public acknowledgement that many veterans had never received. The Cu Chi tunnels themselves became a tourist destination in modern Vietnam, with former battlegrounds converted into museums that attract thousands of visitors annually. Ironically, some tunnel rat veterans found closure by returning to Vietnam and entering the same tunnels they had cleared during the war, this time as tourists rather than warriors. Memorial services and reunions became important healing rituals for tunnel rat veterans and their families. These gatherings provided opportunities to honor fallen comrades, share stories that couldn't be told to civilian audiences, and find meaning in experiences that had shaped their lives in profound ways. The brotherhood forged in underground combat proved to be one of the most enduring and positive legacies of their service. Jim Murrett, president of the Vietnam Tunnel Rats Association in Australia, worked tirelessly to ensure that tunnel rat service was properly recognized and documented. "We need to make sure that the story of what we did is preserved," he emphasized, "not for glory or recognition, but so that future generations understand the price that was paid for freedom and the lengths that ordinary men will go to serve their country when called upon." The tunnel rat experience provided valuable lessons for military planners and medical professionals dealing with the long-term effects of combat stress. The unique psychological challenges of underground warfare highlighted the need for specialized training, equipment, and support systems for soldiers operating in extreme environments. Modern military special operations units study tunnel rat tactics and experiences as part of their training for urban warfare and close quarters combat. The techniques developed by these Vietnam-era volunteers for operating in confined spaces, detecting booby traps, and managing psychological stress remain relevant for contemporary military operations. The medical community's understanding of PTSD and other combat-related conditions was significantly advanced by research into tunnel rat experiences. The complex interactions between physical environment, psychological stress, and long-term mental health outcomes provided insights that benefited all combat veterans, not just those who served underground. The Agent Orange litigation and recognition process was significantly influenced by the advocacy efforts of tunnel rat veterans and their families. Their disproportionate exposure to environmental contaminants and the clear causal relationships between their service and subsequent health problems provided compelling evidence for the toxic effects of chemical warfare on military personnel. For many tunnel rat veterans, the war never truly ended. The battles they fight now are against invisible enemies: PTSD, Agent Orange-related diseases, social isolation, and a society that often fails to understand or appreciate the sacrifices they made. These battles are fought in VA hospitals, therapy sessions, support group meetings, and the privacy of their own minds. The suicide rate among tunnel rat veterans exceeds that of other combat specialties, reflecting the unique psychological burdens these men carry. The combination of survivor guilt, chemical exposure health effects, and inadequate support systems has created a mental health crisis that persists decades after the war ended. Yet many tunnel rat veterans have found ways to transform their traumatic experiences into sources of strength and purpose. Some have become advocates for veterans' rights, using their own struggles to help other combat veterans navigate the complex challenges of post-war life. Others have channeled their experiences into artistic expression, writing, or public speaking that helps educate society about the realities of war and the needs of those who serve. The resilience displayed by tunnel rat veterans in overcoming their post-war challenges demonstrates the same courage and determination that enabled them to survive underground combat. Their ongoing struggles and successes provide inspiration and guidance for current and future generations of combat veterans facing their own battles with invisible wounds and societal indifference. 60 years after the first American soldiers descended into the tunnels of Vietnam, the legacy of the tunnel rats continues to resonate in military doctrine, medical understanding, and the lives of the men who survived that underground war. Their story is one of ordinary Americans asked to do extraordinary things, of young men who faced hell itself, armed with nothing more than courage and a flickering flashlight. The numbers tell only part of the story. Approximately 700 American soldiers served as tunnel rats during the Vietnam War, with casualty rates approaching 33%, among the highest of any military specialty. But statistics cannot capture the full measure of their sacrifice. The psychological wounds that never healed, the health effects that emerged decades later, the families torn apart by invisible injuries that society struggled to understand. What emerges from the darkness of their experience is a testament to human resilience and the bonds of brotherhood forged in extremity. These men did not choose to be heroes. Most would reject the title even now. They were simply soldiers who answered when called, who crawled through spaces that would terrify most people, who faced death in its most intimate forms so that their brothers could live. Their legacy extends beyond the tactical victories they achieved or the intelligence they gathered. They proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. They demonstrated that ordinary men, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can rise to levels of heroism that seem almost superhuman in retrospect. The tunnel rats of Vietnam remind us that freedom is not free, that the security we take for granted is purchased with the blood and sacrifice of those willing to defend it. They descended into darkness so that others could remain in the light, crawled through hell so that democracy might survive, faced their deepest fears so that fear itself would not triumph. In the end, their greatest victory was not military, but moral. The triumph of the human spirit over circumstances designed to break it, the persistence of hope in the face of hopelessness, the endurance of brotherhood in conditions that stripped away everything else. They went into the tunnels as individual soldiers and emerged as legends, their courage echoing through the decades as a reminder of what Americans can accomplish when called upon to serve something greater than themselves. The war in Vietnam ended long ago, but the tunnel rats' battle for recognition, understanding, and healing continues. They deserve more than our gratitude. They deserve our commitment to ensuring that their sacrifices were not in vain, that their service is remembered and honored, and that the lessons learned in those dark passages beneath Vietnam help us build a better world above ground. In the darkness of the tunnels, they carried the light of freedom. In the light of peace, we carry the responsibility to honor their memory and care for those who survive. That is the debt we owe to the tunnel rats, not just for what they did in the tunnels of Vietnam, but for what they continue to teach us about courage, sacrifice, and the price of liberty. The tunnel rats' war may have ended, but their story lives on, a beacon of courage shining from the deepest darkness, reminding us all of the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when called upon to serve something greater than themselves. Non gratum anus redentum, not worth a rat's ass, they said, but they were wrong. They were worth everything.